Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Attila the Hun, one of history's most feared and misunderstood figures. As you settle into this narrative, allow yourself to be transported back to the 5th century, to a world in transformation, where the great Roman Empire was slowly crumbling and new powers were rising from the vast steppes of Central Asia. This is a story of conquest and diplomacy, of a man who became legend, and of an era that changed the course of Western civilization forever. The world before Attila. To understand Attila, we must first understand the world into which he was born. The year was approximately 406 CE, though the exact date remains uncertain, lost to the mists of time. The Roman Empire, which had once seemed eternal, was by this time divided into two halves: the Western Roman Empire, centered in Ravenna and Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later be known as the Byzantine Empire, with its magnificent capital at Constantinople. The empire that had brought order, roads, aqueducts, and a common language to much of the known world was now struggling. Its borders were constantly pressed by various Germanic tribes, and its political structure was weakening from within. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, and the military, once the pride of Rome, increasingly relied on foreign mercenaries and auxiliary troops to defend its vast frontiers. Beyond the empire's borders, in the great grasslands that stretched from the Danube to the borders of China, lived the Huns. These were nomadic peoples, horse warriors who had migrated westward from the steppes of Central Asia over many generations. The exact origins of the Huns remain debated by historians to this day. Some scholars connect them to the Xiongnu, a confederation that had troubled the Chinese Han dynasty centuries earlier, though this connection remains uncertain and contested. What we do know is that the Huns began appearing on the edges of Europe in the late 4th century, and their arrival sent shockwaves through the continent. They were unlike any enemy the Romans had faced before. Their mobility was extraordinary, their archery skills legendary, and their style of warfare utterly foreign to the disciplined infantry tactics of Rome. The Huns were superb horsemen, spending much of their lives in the saddle. Roman writers, often prone to exaggeration and prejudice, described them as practically living on their horses, eating, sleeping, and conducting business without dismounting. While this was certainly hyperbole, it spoke to the genuine shock and awe that these mounted warriors inspired in settled, agricultural societies. The early life of Attila. Into this world of shifting powers and uncertain futures, Attila was born. He was the son of Mundzuk, who was himself the brother of two Hun kings, Oktar and Ruga. This meant that Attila was born into the Hun royal family, though as a nephew rather than a direct heir, his path to power was not assured from birth. We know frustratingly little about Attila's childhood and youth. The historical sources from this period are sparse, and those that exist were written by Romans and Greeks, who had their own biases and agendas. The Huns themselves left no written records, as they were a primarily oral culture. What we can piece together must be constructed from fragmentary references, archaeological evidence, and reasonable inferences about Hun society and customs. As a young man of royal blood, Attila would have received the education appropriate to a Hun warrior and leader. This meant, above all, mastering horsemanship and archery. The composite bow of the Huns, made from wood, horn, and sinew, was a sophisticated weapon that could be fired accurately from horseback at full gallop. Learning to use it effectively required years of practice, beginning in childhood, but Attila's education would have extended beyond military skills. As a member of the royal family, he needed to understand diplomacy, the management of tribal alliances, and the complex web of relationships that held the Hun confederation together. The Huns were not a single, unified people, but rather a confederation of various tribes and peoples united under Hun leadership. Managing these relationships required political acumen and the ability to balance competing interests. We know that at some point in his youth, Attila was sent as a hostage to the Roman court. This was a common practice in the ancient world, where the sons of allied or subjected peoples were sent to live at the courts of more powerful nations. It served multiple purposes. It ensured the good behavior of the hostage's people. It exposed the young man to Roman civilization and culture, and it created personal relationships between future leaders. During his time in the Roman court, possibly in Ravenna or Rome itself, Attila would have observed the workings of the empire at close hand. He would have seen its wealth, its architectural marvels, its sophisticated administration. But he would also have witnessed its weaknesses, the political intrigues, the inefficient bureaucracy, the decadence of the elite, and the growing gap between the empire's pretensions and its actual power. This experience would prove invaluable. Unlike many of his fellow Huns, Attila understood the Roman world from the inside. He learned Latin, he understood Roman diplomatic protocols, and he grasped the strategic and political realities that governed Roman decision-making. This knowledge would serve him well in the decades to come. The rise to power. Attila's path to supreme power began with the death of his uncle, King Ruga, around 434 CE. Ruga had been a successful ruler who had extended Hun influence and extracted substantial tribute payments from the Eastern Roman Empire. Upon his death, power passed not to a single successor, but to two of his nephews, Attila and his brother Bleda, who ruled jointly. This joint kingship reflected Hun traditions and the practical realities of managing a large confederation. The two brothers divided responsibilities and territories, though the exact nature of their power-sharing arrangement remains unclear. What we do know is that they initially worked together effectively, presenting a united front to their subjects and to the Roman Empire. One of their first major acts was to renegotiate the treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire. In 435 CE, they met with Roman envoys at Margus, a city on the Danube frontier. The resulting treaty, known as the Treaty of Margus, was highly favorable to the Huns. It doubled the annual tribute that Constantinople had to pay from 350 pounds of gold to 700 pounds. It also established rules for trade, required the Romans to return Hun fugitives, and prohibited the Romans from making alliances with peoples who were at war with the Huns. This treaty demonstrated several important characteristics of Attila's approach to international relations. First, he understood the value of extracting wealth through diplomacy rather than warfare alone. The tribute payments provided a steady stream of gold that enriched the Hun elite and helped maintain the loyalty of subject tribes. Second, the treaty showed his understanding of Roman psychology and his willingness to humiliate the empire that had once held him hostage. The Romans, who still thought of themselves as masters of the world, were forced to acknowledge the Huns as at least equals, if not superiors. For several years, Attila and Bleda ruled jointly, conducting campaigns in the regions north of the Danube, extending their control over Germanic and other tribes, and managing their relationship with Rome. The exact nature of their relationship is difficult to determine from the sources. Some ancient writers suggested tension and rivalry, while others portrayed them as working in harmony. What happened next is one of the most significant events in Attila's life, though the details remain murky. Around 445 CE, Bleda died, and Attila became sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire. The ancient sources are divided on whether Bleda died of natural causes or whether Attila had him murdered. The Roman historian Jordanus, writing more than a century later, explicitly states that Attila killed his brother, though he provides no details about how or why. Whether through fratricide or simply through the death of his co-ruler, Attila now stood alone at the head of the Hun Confederation. He was approximately 40 years old, an experienced warrior and diplomat, and he was about to embark on a series of campaigns that would shake the Roman world to its foundations. The consolidation of power. As sole ruler, Attila moved quickly to consolidate his position. The Hun Confederation was a complex entity, comprising not just ethnic Huns, but also numerous subject peoples, including Goths, Gepids, Heruls, and others. Each of these groups had their own leaders, traditions, and interests. Holding such a diverse empire together required both force and finesse. Attila demonstrated both. He led campaigns against tribes that showed signs of independence, crushing resistance and incorporating defeated peoples into his military machine. But he also understood the importance of distributing the spoils of conquest. The tribute from Rome, the booty from raids, and the opportunities for glory and warfare all served to bind various groups to his leadership. The Hun political system, as best we can understand it, was based on personal loyalty to the king, rather than on bureaucratic administration or fixed territorial control. Subject peoples were allowed to keep their own leaders and customs as long as they provided warriors for Hun campaigns and acknowledged Attila's supremacy. This was a flexible system that could accommodate diverse groups, but it also meant that the empire's cohesion depended heavily on the personal authority and success of its ruler. Attila established his court somewhere in the region of modern-day Hungary, though the exact location has never been found. Roman envoys who visited his court left descriptions of a substantial settlement with wooden buildings, including a large hall for the king. These descriptions give us some insight into Attila's lifestyle and the nature of his court. Despite controlling an empire and extracting vast amounts of gold from Rome, Attila apparently lived relatively simply. The Roman historian Priscus, who visited his court as part of an embassy in 448 CE, described him as drinking from a wooden cup while his guests used gold and silver vessels. He wore plain clothing while his warriors wore elaborate decorations. Whether this simplicity was genuine or a calculated display of warrior virtue, it served to enhance his authority. It marked him as a true warrior king, unsoftened by luxury, different from the decadent Romans with their silk and their banquets. At his court, Attila managed a complex diplomatic network. He received embassies from the Roman Empire, both east and west. He corresponded with various Germanic kings and tribal leaders. He arbitrated disputes and distributed gifts and honors. In essence, he operated much like any other monarch of his time, despite the nomadic origins of his people. The campaigns against the Eastern Empire. In 441 CE, even before becoming sole ruler, Attila and Bleda had launched a major campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire. The pretext was the alleged violation of the Treaty of Margus, specifically the claim that the Bishop of Margus had crossed the Danube and robbed Hun royal graves. Whether this accusation was true or merely a convenient excuse for war is impossible to determine at this distance. The campaign was devastating. The Hun armies swept across the Balkans, capturing and destroying cities that had stood for centuries. Margus fell, then Singidunum, modern Belgrade, then a string of other fortified towns. The Romans, caught off guard and with their best troops engaged elsewhere, could do little to stop the onslaught. What made the Hun attacks so effective was their combination of mobility and siege capability. The traditional image of the Huns as purely nomadic horsemen who could only raid and retreat is incomplete. By this point, the Huns had mastered siege warfare, possibly learning techniques from subject peoples or captured Roman engineers. They used siege towers, battering rams, and other equipment to take fortified cities. After this first wave of conquest, a peace was negotiated, but it didn't last long. In 447 CE, now as sole ruler, Attila launched an even larger campaign. This time, his armies drove deep into the Balkans, reaching the outskirts of Constantinople itself. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, was forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The resulting peace treaty was extraordinarily humiliating for Rome. The annual tribute was raised to 200 pounds of gold. The empire had to pay a massive one-time sum to cover arrears and ransoms for prisoners. A strip of territory south of the Danube, several days' journey wide, had to be evacuated and left as a buffer zone. Roman refugees from this zone were not to be accepted, and any Roman citizen who had fled to the Huns had to be either returned or ransomed at a price of 12 gold pieces per person. This treaty represented the high point of Attila's dominance over the Eastern Empire. Constantinople, the great city that had never fallen to a barbarian army, had been forced to buy peace through tribute. The Romans, who had once ruled the Mediterranean world, were now paying protection money to a nomadic king from beyond their borders. Yet even in this moment of triumph, there were complexities. Attila, despite his power, chose not to attempt to actually conquer the Eastern Empire. He had the military capability to cause enormous destruction, but he seems to have understood that his nomadic confederation was not suited to governing settled, urban territories. The tribute system was more valuable to him than attempting to rule over cities and provinces. He could extract wealth without the burden of administration. Life at Attila's court. Our most detailed glimpse of Attila and his court comes from the account of Priscus of Panium, a Roman diplomat and historian who visited the Hun capital as part of an embassy in 448 CE. His detailed description provides invaluable insights into Attila's personality, his lifestyle, and the nature of his rule. Priscus describes the journey to Attila's court, traveling through the devastated regions of the Balkans and then into the Hun heartland. Along the way, the embassy encountered various peoples subject to Attila and witnessed the cosmopolitan nature of his empire. At the court itself, they found a thriving settlement with a mixture of architectural styles, reflecting the diverse peoples who had been incorporated into the Hun Confederation. The embassy's first audience with Attila was carefully choreographed. The king received them in his tent, seated and surrounded by his warriors. Priscus describes Attila as a short man with a broad chest, large head, small eyes, a thin beard, and a flat nose. His bearing was proud and his eyes shrewd. He spoke little, carefully weighing his words, and his demeanor was one of controlled authority. One striking detail from Priscus's account concerns a dinner banquet. While guests were served elaborate meals on silver and gold plates, Attila ate simple meat from a wooden platter. While others drank wine from ornate vessels, he drank from a wooden cup. This ostentatious simplicity clearly made an impression on the Roman diplomat, who recorded it in detail. Whether Attila genuinely preferred simplicity or whether this was a calculated display of virtue, it served a political purpose, distinguishing him from both his guests and his own followers. Priscus also describes entertainment at the court. There were feasts with much drinking, singers who performed songs celebrating Attila's victories, and jesters who provided comic relief. The atmosphere seems to have been one of rough camaraderie among warriors, quite different from the elaborate court ceremonies of Constantinople. During their stay, the Roman embassy was there ostensibly to negotiate various diplomatic matters, but they also had a secret mission: to assassinate Attila. A Roman official named Chrysophius had bribed one of Attila's trusted men, Adeco, to murder the king. However, Adeco revealed the plot to Attila, who used it to his advantage. Rather than executing the envoys, Attila sent them back with a message emphasizing Roman treachery and his own magnanimity in sparing them. This incident reveals several aspects of Attila's character and methods. First, he had an effective intelligence network and the loyalty of his key men. Second, he understood the value of propaganda and used the assassination attempt to cast himself as the honorable party and the Romans as treacherous. Third, he showed restraint, recognizing that executing the envoys would accomplish less than sending them back humiliated. Priscus also provides glimpses of Attila's family life. He had multiple wives, following Hun custom, though one, named Kreca, seems to have been his chief wife. They had several sons, and Attila was reportedly very fond of his youngest son, Ernak. The existence of multiple sons would later complicate the succession, as Hun custom did not clearly establish primogeniture. The turn toward the west. By 450 CE, Attila had reached an understanding with the Eastern Roman Empire. The combination of devastating military campaigns and the massive tribute payments had secured his interests in that quarter. Now his attention turned westward, toward the Western Roman Empire and the territories of Gaul, modern France. The Western Empire was, if anything, in even worse shape than its eastern counterpart. It had lost direct control over much of its territory to various Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths controlled much of Spain and southern Gaul. The Vandals had crossed into North Africa and conquered some of the empire's richest provinces. Britain had been abandoned entirely. The empire's effective territory was shrinking, its military was weak, and its politics were chaotic. The immediate pretext for Attila's intervention in the West was characteristically complex. Honoria, the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, had been forced into an unwanted engagement with a Roman senator. In desperation or calculation, she sent a ring to Attila along with a plea for help. Attila chose to interpret this as a marriage proposal and a request for intervention. He claimed half the Western Empire as Honoria's dowry. Whether Attila genuinely believed he could marry an imperial princess, or whether this was simply a convenient pretext for war, is debatable. What is clear is that by 451 CE, he had assembled a massive army and was preparing to invade Gaul. The army that crossed the Rhine was enormous by the standards of the time. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, from 500,000 to more, but these are certainly exaggerations. Modern historians estimate the force at perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 warriors, still a formidable host. The army included not just Huns, but also Gepids, Ostrogoths, and other subject peoples, each contingent led by its own king or chief, but all following Attila's banner. The invasion began in early 451 CE. Attila's forces crossed the Rhine and moved westward through Gaul, besieging and capturing cities along their route. Metz fell after a siege. Strasbourg was taken. The Huns moved through Champagne, leaving destruction in their wake. City after city opened its gates or was stormed and sacked. The target seemed to be Orleans, a strategic city on the Loire River. If Orleans fell, the way would be open to the heart of Gaul and perhaps even to the rich regions beyond. But here, Attila's advance was finally checked. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. The Roman response to Attila's invasion was coordinated by Flavius Aetius, the supreme commander of the Western Roman military, and effectively the power behind the throne. Aetius was himself an interesting figure, a Roman general who had spent time as a hostage among the Huns in his youth, and knew them well. Indeed, he had previously used Hun mercenaries in his campaigns, and was said to have been on good terms with Attila. Now, however, Aetius faced his former allies as enemies. He assembled an army that was itself remarkably diverse. It included Roman regular forces, what remained of them, as well as Frankish warriors, Burgundians, and crucially, a large contingent of Visigoths under their king, Theodoric III. The alliance between Rome and the Visigoths is worth pausing to consider. The Visigoths were themselves Germanic invaders who had established a kingdom in southern Gaul and Spain at Rome's expense. Only decades earlier, they had sacked Rome itself. Yet now, faced with the Hun threat, they allied with the empire against a common enemy. This reflects the complex political reality of the 5th century, where yesterday's invaders became today's allies against tomorrow's threats. The two armies met somewhere on the Catalaunian Plains, near modern Châlons-en-Champagne, in June 451 CE. The exact location of the battlefield has never been conclusively identified, one of history's frustrating mysteries. What we know of the battle itself comes from fragmentary and often contradictory sources, particularly from Jordanes, who was writing a century later and may have embellished considerably. According to the traditional account, the battle was fiercely contested and extremely bloody. The fighting lasted all day, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The Visigothic king, Theodoric, was killed in the fighting, adding to the battle's significance. As darkness fell, both armies withdrew to their camps, exhausted. The aftermath of the battle is as important as the battle itself. Despite what may have been a tactical stalemate, Attila chose to withdraw. He pulled his army back toward the Rhine, giving up his advance into Gaul. Aetius, rather than pursuing and attempting to destroy the Hun army, allowed them to retreat. Why did both commanders make these choices? For Attila, several factors may have influenced his decision. His army had suffered significant casualties. He was deep in enemy territory, far from his base of power. The alliance against him was holding together, and perhaps most importantly, the death of Theodoric created an opportunity for him to exploit Visigothic instability later. For Aetius, the decision not to pursue was likely political. If the Hun threat was completely eliminated, his own usefulness to the Western Empire would diminish. The Visigothic army, having lost its king, needed to return home to manage the succession, and a weakened but intact Hun kingdom could still serve as a useful counterweight to other threats. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains is often portrayed in Western tradition as the salvation of Christian Europe from barbarian hordes, the moment when the tide of invasion was finally turned. This is an oversimplification, reflecting later medieval concerns more than 5th century realities. The battle was significant, certainly, but it was more a check on Hun expansion than a decisive defeat. Attila remained powerful, his army intact enough to campaign again, and his empire still stretched from the steppes to the Rhine. The Italian campaign, in 452 CE, just 1 year after his withdrawal from Gaul, Attila launched a new campaign, this time into Italy itself. If he could not have Gaul, perhaps he could have Italy. Or perhaps this was about demonstrating that the previous year's withdrawal had not been a defeat, that he remained a threat, that his power was undiminished. The invasion of Italy followed a different pattern from the Gallic campaign. Rather than striking deep into the country immediately, Attila's forces methodically besieged and captured cities in the northeast. Aquileia, one of the largest and richest cities of northern Italy, fell after a prolonged siege. The destruction was so complete that the city never fully recovered. Refugees from Aquileia would later help found Venice, building their city in the lagoons, where they hoped the horsemen of the steppes could not follow. Other cities fell in rapid succession: Padua, Verona, Visetia, modern Vicenza. Milan may have been occupied, though the sources are unclear. The Huns pushed steadily southward, and there seemed little to stop them from reaching Rome itself. The Western Roman Empire was, by this point, almost helpless. Its military forces were scattered and weak. Emperor Valentinian III was ineffectual. The famous Roman general Aetius had few resources to oppose the invasion. The countryside was ravaged, and refugees fled before the advancing Hun armies. Then, something unexpected happened. Attila stopped his advance. Rather than pushing on to Rome, he negotiated with a Roman embassy, accepted some form of payment or tribute, and withdrew his forces back across the Alps. The invasion ended not with a climactic battle or a siege of the Eternal City, but with Attila simply choosing to turn back. Why did Attila withdraw from Italy? This question has puzzled historians for centuries, and the ancient sources offer various explanations. The most famous account comes from Christian tradition, which attributes the withdrawal to the intervention of Pope Leo III. According to this story, Leo met with Attila and, through a combination of spiritual authority and persuasive arguments, convinced him to spare Rome and withdraw from Italy. There is some truth to this account. Leo did lead an embassy to meet Attila, but the reality was likely more complex and mundane. Several practical factors probably influenced Attila's decision. First, his army was suffering from disease. Plague or some other epidemic seems to have broken out among the troops. Second, supplies were running short, and Italy, already ravaged by previous invasions and internal strife, could not easily support a large army. Third, there were reports that the Eastern Roman Empire was taking advantage of his absence to attack Hun territories across the Danube. Fourth, he had achieved his immediate objectives, extracting payment from Rome and demonstrating his power. Fifth, attempting to actually conquer and hold Italy may have seemed impractical for a nomadic confederation. Whatever the exact combination of reasons, Attila withdrew from Italy in 452 CE. He returned to his court beyond the Danube, his power and reputation intact. He had humbled both halves of the Roman Empire, extracted enormous tribute payments, and carved out an empire stretching from Germany to the Caspian Sea. He had become a legend, feared throughout the civilized world. He was, at that moment, perhaps the most powerful man in Europe. He had less than a year to live. The death of Attila. In 453 CE, Attila took yet another wife. Despite already having multiple wives and concubines, he married a young woman named Ildiko. The wedding feast was, according to the sources, particularly lavish, with much drinking and celebration. It was to be Attila's last celebration. On the morning after the wedding, servants came to Attila's chamber to attend him, but received no answer. As the morning wore on and there was still no sign of the king, they grew concerned. Finally, they broke down the door and entered the room. They found Attila dead, lying in a pool of blood. His new wife, Ildiko, was huddled in the corner, frightened but unharmed. According to the account preserved by the Roman historian Priscus and later repeated by Jordanes, Attila had suffered a severe nosebleed during the night. In his drunken state, he had not awakened as the blood flowed, and he had effectively drowned in his own blood. This unheroic death, not in battle but from a nosebleed, in his bed on his wedding night, seems almost anticlimactic for such a legendary figure. Some historians have suspected foul play, suggesting that Ildico or others might have assassinated him. But the sources don't support this, and the manner of death, while unusual, is medically plausible. Attila was probably in his late 40s, not young by the standards of his time. He had lived a hard life, fought many campaigns, and, if the accounts of his lifestyle are accurate, drank heavily. A severe nosebleed combined with intoxication could indeed have killed him. The reaction of the Huns to their leader's death is revealing. According to the sources, his warriors cut their faces with swords and mourned him not with tears, but with blood, as befitted a warrior king. They believed that the greatest of warriors should be mourned by warriors in a warrior's way. Attila's funeral was conducted in secret, in the Hun tradition. His body was placed in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbolizing the tribute he had extracted from the nations he had conquered. He was buried at night in an undisclosed location, along with great treasures. The slaves who dug the grave were killed to ensure that the location would never be revealed. To this day, Attila's burial place has never been found, though many have searched for it over the centuries. With Attila's death, the question of succession immediately arose. Unlike Roman or Persian tradition, the Huns had no clear system of primogeniture. Attila had multiple sons, including Elik, Dengizic, and Ernak, among others, and each had supporters among different factions of the Hun Confederation. What followed was entirely predictable. The empire that Attila had built through personal authority and military success began to fall apart. His sons fought among themselves for supremacy. Subject peoples saw an opportunity to throw off Hun domination. The Germanic tribes that had been forced to acknowledge Hun overlordship rose in rebellion. The decisive moment came in 454 CE, just a year after Attila's death, at a battle fought on the banks of the Nidau River. The exact location is unknown, but it was somewhere in the Pannonian region. A coalition of Germanic peoples, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Herulls, and others, defeated the Huns under Elik, Attila's eldest son. Elik himself was killed in the battle. This defeat shattered what remained of Hun power in Central Europe. The subject peoples regained their independence. The Hun Confederation fragmented into smaller groups. Some Huns remained in the region, gradually being absorbed into other populations. Others retreated eastward to the steppes from which their ancestors had come. The great Hun Empire, which had seemed so formidable just a few years earlier, effectively ceased to exist. The legacy and memory of Attila. The story of Attila did not end with his death or the collapse of his empire. Indeed, in many ways, his legendary life was just beginning. Over the centuries that followed, the memory of Attila would be transformed, distorted, and reimagined in countless ways across many cultures. In the Christian tradition of Western Europe, particularly as recorded by writers who survived the Hun invasions, Attila became the Scourge of God, a divine punishment sent to chastise the sinful and test the faith of Christians. This epithet emphasized his role as a destructive force, an instrument of divine will rather than a man making strategic choices based on his own interests and circumstances. The medieval church found in Attila a useful figure for sermons about the wages of sin and the need for faith. Pope Leo's meeting with Attila became the subject of numerous artistic representations throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. Paintings and sculptures depicted the Pope, backed by heavenly visions of St. Peter and St. Paul, facing down the barbarian king. These images served to emphasize papal authority and the power of Christian faith over earthly might. Whether or not Leo's intervention was actually decisive in Attila's withdrawal from Italy became less important than what the story represented. In Germanic and Nordic traditions, Attila became a figure in heroic literature. He appears in the Nibelungenlied, the great German epic, where he is called Etzel and is portrayed more sympathetically as a powerful king and a widow seeking vengeance. In Norse sagas, he appears as Atli, a tragic figure caught up in the cycles of revenge and loyalty that characterize saga literature. These traditions, while far removed from historical reality, reveal how Attila's fame had spread far beyond the regions he actually campaigned in. Interestingly, in Hungarian tradition, Attila occupies a unique place. Although the Huns and the Hungarians, Magyars, are different peoples with different origins, the Magyars arrived in the region centuries after the Hun Empire collapsed. Hungarian nationalist historiography in the 19th century claimed Attila as a national hero, a Proto-Hungarian who ruled from Hungarian lands. This romantic nationalism persists to some degree today, and Attila remains a popular name in Hungary. In modern popular culture, Attila has become a stock figure representing barbarism, cruelty, and military prowess. His name is invoked as a synonym for destructive savagery. Meeting one's Attila or similar phrases persist in various European languages to describe encounters with devastating forces. This reputation, while rooted in some historical reality, Attila did lead destructive campaigns and besiege cities, is also a simplified caricature that misses the complexity of the actual historical figure. The historical Attila was not simply a mindless destroyer. He was a skilled diplomat who understood the value of negotiation and the strategic use of military force. He maintained a multi-ethnic empire through a combination of military pressure and political acumen. He extracted more wealth from Rome through tribute than he probably could have gained through conquest alone. He understood his enemies well, having lived among them as a young man. At the same time, we should not romanticize Attila or minimize the genuine suffering his campaigns caused. His armies did sack cities, kill civilians, and leave devastation in their wake. The archaeological record confirms widespread destruction in the Balkans during his campaigns. Thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, died directly or indirectly because of his invasions. The terror his name inspired was real and justified. Reflecting on an age of transformation. To truly understand Attila and his significance, we must place him in the context of his age. The 5th century was a period of profound transformation in Europe and the Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire, which had brought unprecedented unity and organization to the region, was fragmenting. New peoples, new kingdoms, and new political arrangements were emerging. The Hun invasions, while destructive, were part of a larger pattern of population movements and power shifts. Germanic peoples were not being driven into the empire solely by Hun pressure. They were also attracted by the empire's wealth, its relatively vacant frontiers, and opportunities for military service and settlement. The empire itself was not a passive victim, but an active participant in these changes, often inviting Germanic warriors to settle as federates or employing them as mercenaries. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, traditionally dated to 476 CE, just 2 decades after Attila's death, was not caused by the Huns. Indeed, the collapse of Hun power removed one of the threats that had helped justify Roman military expenditure and political centralization. The factors that brought down the Western Empire were complex and internal: economic decline, political instability, military weakness, and the gradual transformation of Roman institutions and identity. Yet Attila's campaigns did hasten these processes. They demonstrated Roman weakness. They disrupted trade and agriculture. They forced the empire to divert resources to pay tribute rather than maintaining infrastructure or military forces. They showed other peoples that Rome could be challenged, invaded, and forced to make humiliating concessions. In the East, the story was different. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the Hun threat and would continue for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The tribute payments that Attila extracted were enormous but temporary. The Balkans were devastated but eventually recovered. The walls of Constantinople, which Attila never seriously tested, proved impregnable to enemies for centuries to come. The man behind the legend. Who was Attila, really? What can we say about the man himself, separate from the legend and the myth? The sources give us frustratingly little personal detail. Priscus's account provides some physical description and glimpses of behavior, but it is limited and filtered through the perspective of a Roman who saw Attila as an enemy and a barbarian. Other sources are even more fragmentary and biased. What seems clear is that Attila was highly intelligent and politically astute. His ability to hold together a multi-ethnic confederation, to negotiate with Romans who considered themselves culturally superior, and to conduct diplomatic and military campaigns simultaneously across a vast region required considerable skill. He understood both Hun warrior culture and Roman political culture, and he could operate effectively in both contexts. He was apparently charismatic, inspiring loyalty among his followers and fear among his enemies. The fact that his empire collapsed so quickly after his death suggests that his personal authority was crucial to holding it together, that the confederation was built around him rather than around institutions that could outlast him. He was ruthless when necessary, as his treatment of captured cities and the possible murder of his brother demonstrate. Yet he also showed restraint at times, as in his withdrawal from Italy and his handling of diplomatic relations. He seemed to understand that his power ultimately rested on success, and that pure destruction without strategic purpose would be counterproductive. His personal life, as much as we can glimpse it, seems to have been relatively simple by the standards of monarchs of his time. The accounts of his plain clothing and wooden cup may be propaganda, but they suggest at least that he wanted to be seen as a warrior first, not softened by luxury and wealth. Whether he genuinely preferred simplicity or merely performed it for political effect, we cannot know. He was, by all accounts, devoted to at least some of his children, particularly his youngest son, Ernak. He had multiple wives, but seems to have maintained a relatively stable family life, avoiding the kind of succession disputes that plagued many monarchies until after his death made them inevitable. The military achievement. From a purely military perspective, Attila's achievements were considerable, if ultimately temporary. He took a confederation of nomadic peoples and molded them into a force that could not only raid, but also conduct sophisticated siege warfare. He coordinated campaigns across thousands of miles of territory. He demonstrated that mobility and flexibility could overcome the fortifications and disciplined infantry that had been Rome's traditional advantages. His military strategy showed considerable sophistication. He understood the value of rapid movement and surprise. He used feints and diversions. He maintained intelligence networks that kept him informed about conditions in enemy territory. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate, when to press an advantage and when to withdraw. The Hun military system itself was innovative. The composite bow, fired from horseback, provided unmatched firepower for the era. The Huns could advance, fire, and retreat before infantry could respond. They could harass armies, disrupt supply lines, and control vast areas with relatively small forces. When they needed to take fortified positions, they showed that they could learn or appropriate Roman siege techniques. Yet Attila's military success was built on the inherent strengths of his forces: mobility, archery, and cavalry tactics, rather than on creating fundamentally new military innovations. Once his enemies learned to counter these tactics, once they assembled cavalry forces of their own and adapted their strategies, the Huns' advantage diminished. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains showed that the Huns could be fought on relatively even terms by a well-coordinated coalition. The economic system. The economic basis of Attila's empire is worth examining because it reveals both the empire's strengths and its fundamental weaknesses. The Hun economy was based on several pillars: tribute from subject peoples, raids and plunder from campaigns, tribute payments from the Roman Empire, and control of trade routes. The tribute from the Roman Empire was particularly significant. At its peak, the Eastern Empire was paying thousands of pounds of gold annually to the Huns. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to a significant portion of the empire's tax revenue. The gold flowed into Attila's court, where it was distributed to reward loyal followers, maintain alliances with subject peoples, and display the wealth and power of the Hun king. This system worked well as long as Attila remained successful and feared. The gold kept flowing, subject peoples remained loyal, and the empire held together. But it was inherently unstable. It depended on external sources of wealth rather than on productive economic activity within the Hun territories. It required continuous success to maintain, as any sign of weakness would encourage subject peoples to rebel and the Romans to stop paying. When Attila died and his successors fought among themselves, the system collapsed rapidly. The tribute stopped flowing, subject peoples rebelled, and without the external wealth to distribute as rewards, the Confederation lost its economic basis. This reveals a fundamental limitation of nomadic empires. They could conquer and control settled territories, but they struggled to transform military dominance into lasting economic and political structures. The diplomatic legacy. Perhaps Attila's most lasting impact was on the development of diplomatic relations in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. His interactions with the Roman Empire established precedents and patterns that would be repeated many times in subsequent centuries. The practice of paying tribute to avoid invasion became standard for the Byzantine Empire and later European kingdoms when faced with powerful nomadic adversaries. The Byzantines would pay tribute to various peoples for centuries, treating it as a cost-effective alternative to maintaining large military forces. This pragmatic approach to security, while humiliating to Roman pride, reflected the realities of power in a changing world. Attila's willingness to negotiate, to use the threat of force rather than force itself when it served his purposes, showed that the barbarians were not mindlessly violent, but rational actors pursuing their interests through a combination of military and diplomatic means. This understanding, while not universally accepted, gradually changed how settled empires dealt with nomadic peoples. The embassy system that brought Roman diplomats to Attila's court and Hun envoys to Constantinople and Ravenna created channels of communication and established protocols for interaction between very different cultures. These diplomatic practices would be adapted and continued long after the Hun Empire itself had disappeared. The cultural impact. Attila's invasions had profound cultural impacts that extended far beyond the immediate political and military consequences. The devastation of cities in the Balkans and northern Italy disrupted trade networks, displaced populations, and contributed to the broader economic decline of the Western Mediterranean region in the 5th century. The migrations triggered by Hun pressure and by the campaigns of Attila himself reshaped the ethnic and linguistic map of Europe. Peoples displaced from their traditional territories moved into new regions, leading to the complex mixture of populations that would characterize early medieval Europe. The Visigoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, and other Germanic peoples all found themselves in new locations, partly due to Hun-related pressures. The psychological impact may have been even more significant than the physical destruction. The Romans had long considered themselves the civilized world, surrounded by barbarians who were militarily inferior and culturally backward. The Hun invasions shattered this confidence. Here was an enemy that could not be easily understood or categorized within Roman concepts, that seemed to live and fight in ways utterly foreign to Mediterranean civilization, and that could nevertheless defeat Roman armies and dictate terms to Roman emperors. This shock to Roman identity and self-conception contributed to the broader crisis of confidence that characterized the late Western Empire. If Rome could no longer protect its citizens, if emperors could be forced to pay tribute to nomadic kings, what did it mean to be Roman? These questions would trouble intellectuals and political leaders for generations. The religious dimension. Attila's relationship to religion is complex and not entirely clear from the sources. The Huns apparently practiced a form of shamanism, with religious specialists who conducted divination and communicated with the spirit world. When Priscus visited Attila's court, he noted some of these practices, though his descriptions are brief and filtered through his own cultural assumptions. Attila himself seems to have been relatively tolerant of different religions within his empire. Subject peoples were allowed to maintain their own religious practices, whether they were pagan Germans or Christians. This pragmatic tolerance was typical of many nomadic empires, where religious uniformity was less important than political loyalty and military service. However, Attila's invasions had significant religious implications for the Christian world. The devastation of churches and monasteries, the deaths of bishops and monks, and the enslavement of Christian populations were seen by contemporary Christian writers as divine punishment for sin. This interpretation cast Attila as an instrument of God's wrath, giving his invasions cosmic significance. The legend of Pope Leo's meeting with Attila, whatever its historical basis, became a powerful symbol of the Church's spiritual authority over temporal power. It reinforced the idea that true power came from God and that Christian faith could protect believers from even the most terrible earthly threats. This narrative would be invoked repeatedly throughout the Middle Ages to assert papal authority. Comparisons with other conquerors. It's instructive to compare Attila with other great conquerors of history. Like Alexander the Great, he created a vast empire through military conquest and personal charisma. But unlike Alexander, he did not seek to spread a culture or create lasting institutions. His empire was extractive rather than transformative, designed to channel wealth to the Hun elite rather than to integrate conquered peoples into a new political order. Attila might be better compared to Genghis Khan, who would emerge from the Mongolian steppes 7 and half centuries later. Both were nomadic conquerors who built multi-ethnic empires through a combination of military prowess and diplomatic skill. Both extracted enormous tribute from settled civilizations. Both were masters of mounted warfare and psychological intimidation. But Genghis Khan created more durable institutions, and his empire proved more resilient, lasting well beyond his death and splitting into several successor khanates that persisted for centuries. Perhaps the closest parallel is with other leaders of nomadic confederations who briefly threatened settled empires before their empires collapsed. Figures like Alaric the Visigoth, who sacked Rome in 410, or the various steppe peoples who would threaten China, Persia, and Europe throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages. What distinguished Attila was the extent of his success, the wealth he extracted, and the terror his name inspired, but the pattern was not unique. The historical assessment. What, then, is the final assessment of Attila from a historical perspective? He was unquestionably significant, one of the major figures of the 5th century, who shaped the course of events during a crucial period of transition. His campaigns accelerated the decline of the Western Roman Empire, demonstrated the vulnerability of Roman power, and contributed to the transformation of Europe from a Mediterranean-centered Roman world to the fragmented, multi-ethnic landscape of the early Middle Ages. Yet his impact was more destructive than constructive. He built no lasting institutions, founded no dynasty, spread no religion or culture, established no new political principles. His empire depended entirely on his personal authority and collapsed within a year of his death. The Huns, who had seemed so threatening in the mid-5th century, vanished from history as a distinct people within a few decades. This transience does not mean Attila was unimportant, but it does put his importance in perspective. He was a pivotal figure in an age of transition, a man whose choices and actions had enormous consequences, but he was more a symptom of larger historical forces than their cause. The Roman Empire was already weakening when he appeared, and would have continued to decline even without the Hun invasions. The Germanic migrations were already underway, driven by factors that had nothing to do with the Huns. What Attila did was accelerate these processes, make them more visible and dramatic, and in doing so, help to shape how subsequent generations understood the fall of Rome and the birth of medieval Europe. In that sense, his importance is as much about memory and representation as about actual historical causation. The archaeological evidence. It's worth noting that our understanding of Attila and the Huns has been complicated by the relative scarcity of archaeological evidence. The Huns, as a nomadic people, left few permanent settlements and built little that would survive into the archaeological record. Unlike the Romans with their cities, roads, and monuments, or even other Germanic peoples with their villages and cemeteries, the Huns left light marks on the landscape. What archaeological evidence we do have tends to confirm some aspects of the literary sources while complicating others. We find evidence of widespread destruction in Balkan cities during the period of Hun invasions, confirming the accounts of devastating campaigns. We find evidence of Hun military equipment, particularly their distinctive bows and arrows, as well as decorative items showing their artistic styles. Burial sites attributed to the Huns show evidence of their burial practices and provide insights into their material culture. These graves often contain weapons, horse equipment, and personal ornaments, confirming the importance of horses and warfare in Hun society. The use of artificial cranial deformation, a practice where infants' heads were bound to produce a distinctive elongated shape, appears in some skeletal remains and may have been a mark of Hun or Hun-associated populations. However, definitively identifying Hun material remains versus those of associated peoples is often difficult. The Hun Confederation included many different ethnic groups, and material culture often shows mixed influences. A burial with typical steppe warrior equipment could belong to a Hun, a Gepid in Hun service, or an Ostrogoth allied with the Huns. The lack of Attila's tomb, despite centuries of searching, is a particular frustration for historians and archaeologists. If found, it would likely be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to late antiquity, potentially containing rich grave goods and providing physical evidence to compare with the literary descriptions. But the secret burial that so effectively protected Attila's remains in the 5th century continues to guard its secrets today. The question of motivation. One of the most intriguing questions about Attila concerns his ultimate motivations and goals. What did he actually want? Was he simply a raider on a large scale, seeking wealth and glory? Did he have ambitions to conquer and rule the Roman Empire? Was he building an empire for its own sake or as a means to an end? The evidence suggests a more pragmatic and limited set of goals than the grand ambitions we might attribute to a great conqueror. Attila seems to have understood that his nomadic confederation was not suited to ruling settled, urban territories. When he had opportunities to conquer Roman territory outright, he often chose instead to extract tribute and withdraw. This suggests he valued the wealth and prestige that came from forcing Rome to pay him more than he valued the burden of actually governing Roman provinces. His military campaigns seem designed more to maintain his confederation's cohesion and ensure continued tribute payments than to pursue territorial conquest for its own sake. The raids and invasions served multiple purposes. They enriched his followers. They demonstrated his power and military prowess. They kept subject peoples loyal through the prospect of continued plunder, and they justified the tribute payments from Rome. The incident with Honoria and the claim to half the Western Empire can be understood in this light. Whether or not Attila seriously believed he could marry a Roman princess, the claim provided a pretext for war that had a certain logic within Roman diplomatic conventions. It allowed him to cast himself as a legitimate claimant rather than merely a barbarian raider. Whether he ever intended to actually rule half the Western Empire or whether this was simply diplomatic posturing is impossible to determine. The human cost. Any assessment of Attila must grapple with the human cost of his campaigns. Ancient warfare was brutal by any standard, and the casualties from battles, sieges, and the disruption of civilian life were enormous. While we can never know exact numbers, it's clear that thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, died directly or indirectly because of Hun invasions. Cities were besieged, stormed, and sacked. Civilians were killed, enslaved, or displaced. Agricultural land was devastated, leading to famine and disease. Trade networks were disrupted, causing economic hardship. The Balkans, in particular, suffered enormously from repeated Hun campaigns, with some cities never fully recovering. The practice of enslaving captives was standard for the time, but this doesn't make it less horrific. Thousands of people were torn from their homes and families, forced into servitude among the Huns, or sold to others. Roman sources preserve heart-wrenching accounts of parents and children being separated, of educated city dwellers forced to live as slaves among peoples whose language and customs they could not understand. At the same time, we should be careful not to attribute a unique level of cruelty to Attila or the Huns. Roman warfare could be equally brutal. The Romans themselves had enslaved millions during their centuries of expansion. The Germanic peoples who would eventually inherit the Western Empire were not notably gentler in their treatment of conquered populations. The 5th century was, in general, a violent age, and Attila was a man of his time. The counterfactual question. Historians generally avoid counterfactual speculation. What might have happened if events had unfolded differently? But it's hard to resist asking what might have occurred if Attila had lived longer. At his death, he was still in his prime as a ruler, with his authority apparently secure and his power at its height. Had he lived another decade or two, how might history have been different? It's possible that even with a longer life, his empire would still have collapsed after his death. The structural weaknesses. dependence on external tribute, the personal nature of authority, the diverse and potentially fractious nature of the confederation would still have existed. No nomadic empire of the steppes succeeded in creating institutions that could survive the death of a powerful founder without major crises. However, a longer reign might have given Attila time to address some of these weaknesses, perhaps by developing more systematic succession arrangements or by creating administrative structures to manage the confederation. It might have given him time to launch more campaigns, potentially against the Eastern Empire or deeper into the West. The fragile political situation in both halves of the Roman Empire meant that opportunities for further expansion existed. Alternatively, his power might have gradually waned as the Romans adapted to the Hun threat, as subject peoples grew restless, and as the easy victories and tribute payments became harder to achieve. Attila's success was built on a particular combination of Roman weakness and Hun strength that might not have lasted indefinitely. The end of an era. Attila's death in 453 CE marked not just the end of a man's life, but the end of an era. The great Hun Empire that had dominated Central Europe and threatened both halves of the Roman Empire for 2 decades collapsed almost immediately. Within a generation, the Huns had virtually disappeared from history as a distinct people, absorbed into other populations or retreating back to the steppes. But the world Attila left behind was fundamentally changed from the one he had entered. The Western Roman Empire, weakened by Hun invasions and the tribute payments they necessitated, would fall within a generation. New Germanic kingdoms were established in Gaul, Spain, Italy, and North Africa. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Franks, all would build kingdoms on Roman soil, creating the foundations of medieval Europe. The Eastern Empire survived, but it too was changed. It had learned that walls and tribute payments could accomplish what armies could not. It had adapted to a world where it was no longer the undisputed master, but rather one power among several. This adaptation would serve it well in the centuries to come, as it faced threats from Persians, Arabs, Slavs, and Turks. The balance of power in Europe had shifted fundamentally. The Mediterranean was no longer the center of the civilized world. The focus moved northward, to the regions where Germanic kingdoms were establishing themselves. Latin remained the language of learning and the church, but new languages were emerging that would eventually become French, Spanish, Italian, and the other Romance languages. Christianity was consolidating its position as the dominant religion, but it too was changing, adapting to a world of warrior kingdoms rather than a unified empire. Conclusion. As our long night's journey through the life and times of Attila draws to a close, what can we take away from this examination of one of history's most famous or infamous figures? Attila was a product of his age, shaped by the traditions of the steppe nomads and the experience of hostage life in Rome. He rose to power through a combination of skill, ruthlessness, and opportunity. He built an empire through military prowess and diplomatic acumen, extracting unprecedented levels of tribute from the Roman Empire and demonstrating that nomadic peoples could challenge even the greatest settled civilizations. Yet his empire was built on unstable foundations. It depended on his personal authority, on external sources of wealth, on the continued fear and respect of enemies and allies alike. When he died unexpectedly in his late 40s, the whole structure collapsed with stunning rapidity. Within a year, his empire was fragmenting. Within a generation, the Huns had largely disappeared from history. Attila's true significance lies not in what he built. His empire proved ephemeral, but in what he destroyed or helped to destroy. His campaigns accelerated the fall of the Western Roman Empire, demonstrated the vulnerability of Roman power and contributed to the transformation of Europe. His name became a legend, a symbol of barbarian terror and destructive power, invoked for centuries after his actual historical significance had faded. But he was also more than just a destroyer. He was a skilled diplomat who understood both Hun and Roman culture. He was a capable administrator who held together a diverse confederation for 2 decades. He was apparently capable of personal loyalty and family affection. He was, in short, a complete human being, not just a symbol or a force of nature. The historical Attila, the man who ate from wooden plates, who negotiated with Roman envoys, who married many wives, who withdrew from Italy for practical rather than mystical reasons, who died from a nosebleed rather than in glorious battle, is in many ways more interesting than the legendary Scourge of God. He reminds us that history is made by real people making choices based on the circumstances they face, not by monsters or demigods from myth. His life spanned one of the most significant transitions in Western history, the period when the ancient world was giving way to the medieval. He was not the cause of this transition, but he was certainly one of its agents. The world before Attila was still recognizably the world of the Roman Empire, united under one law and one emperor, at least in theory. The world after Attila was fragmented, divided into multiple kingdoms, looking forward to the Middle Ages, rather than backward to classical antiquity. In the end, Attila remains an enigma, a figure we can glimpse only imperfectly through fragmentary sources and the distorting lens of legend. We can reconstruct the outline of his life and career. We can understand his historical significance. But the man himself, his thoughts, his motivations, his private self, remains forever beyond our reach. Perhaps that is fitting for someone who was buried in secret, whose tomb has never been found, who vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. As you reflect on this story, consider how often history is shaped by individuals who, like Attila, emerge from obscurity, dominate their age, and then vanish, leaving only memories and consequences. Consider how empires rise and fall, how power shifts from one people to another, how the certainties of one generation become the forgotten relics of the next. Consider how difficult it is to truly know the past, how we must piece together our understanding from fragments and traces, always aware that much remains hidden. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you might reflect on the impermanence of all human achievements. The mightiest empires crumble. The most feared conquerors die from mundane causes. The gold and tribute that seemed so important disappear into the earth or are melted down and remade. What endures is the story, the memory, the attempt to understand what came before us. Attila's empire lasted less than a generation. His name has lasted 15 centuries and counting. In that strange alchemy by which history becomes legend and legend becomes myth, the Hun king who died in his bed has become immortal in human memory. Whether that immortality does justice to the historical man is impossible to say, but it reminds us of the power of narrative, of the human need to tell stories about our past, to find meaning in the chaos of events, to create heroes and villains from the complex, messy reality of history. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the sweep of history, the thunder of hoofbeats across ancient plains, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding a little more about the complicated, fascinating story of humanity's past.